Neighbors went missing from a farming town in the Dalelands and started coming back at night days after they disappeared, and they started feeding on their old neighbors until the town had no blood left to give. Every family either dead or turned, and the survivors who fled refused to speak its name again. So the survivors buried the old name. A place once called Merrydale, renamed Daggerdale by the people who wanted to forget what had happened there. The original name too painful for anyone who remembered what it used to mean. Centuries later, the same hunger reached Baldur's Gate, and what spread between those two moments crossed every border on the continent. The vampire who emptied Merrydale was called Cassiar, a master vampire who had infested the town so thoroughly that the people who vanished were not replaced by strangers. They were replaced by themselves, the same faces returning to the same houses, carrying a hunger that recognized the people inside. Mothers who had cooked for their families, standing in doorways at dusk waiting for their own sons to open the door. Fathers who had worked the same fields for decades, walking home along familiar paths toward homes where the living still slept without knowing the thing on the threshold used to be the person who built the bed. And in the morning, the survivors had to stake their own turned family members through the chest to stop them from rising again the next night. Parents driving wood through their own children. Cassiar delighted in forcing the ones he controlled to commit acts so vile they could never return to what they had been, commanding his spawn. Victims he had turned into vampires, stripped of every freedom they once carried, and compelled to obey the thing that made them without hesitation, to drink the blood of an infant in front of witnesses, so the horror of what they had become could never be denied or undone. He turned a man named Gideon into a spawn, used Gideon to lure a gold elf of the sun-touched bloodline named Jander Sunstar into an ambush, and owned Jander for over a century, 100 years of forced obedience to the thing that had eaten his life. The system that consumed Merrydale did not need Cassiar to persist. It needed only the bond, and Jander carried that bond across the continent for centuries after Cassiar was destroyed in Mistledale. In the largest city on the Sword Coast, Jander fed on patients locked inside an asylum, people whose screams would not be investigated because they screamed every night anyway, and he fell in love with one of them, a woman named Anna cursed to never age or escape her own madness. When Anna refused to be turned and died in his arms, Jander slaughtered every remaining patient in the building and set the asylum on fire. The man who had spent years telling himself he was showing mercy by feeding on the forgotten, burning the place to the ground with their bodies still inside it. He was drawn into Ravenloft, a demiplane of dread that functions as a prison dimension for the worst creatures the multiverse has produced, and battled a vampire lord named Strad von Zarovich, who had been trapped in his own domain for centuries. Jander spent lifetimes trying to resist the system that Cassiar had forced on him, and the cost of that resistance was everything he touched, every patient drained in the dark, every friendship poisoned by what he carried, proof that the curse does not offer a middle path between feeding and freedom. Cassiar proved a vampire could erase a town, and Jander proved that even the ones who fought the hunger still destroyed everything around them. But the next vampire stopped fighting it entirely and took a throne. A port city on the Dragon Coast called Westgate woke one morning to find its king and his entire family dead, massacred in a single night by a small army of mercenaries who had poured out of the catacombs beneath the city while the defenders slept. The vampire who seized Westgate was called Orlak, and between sunset and sunrise, he and his mercenaries killed King Thorndare, killed his wife, killed every one of his children, and by morning, there was no member of the royal bloodline left alive in the city. He held court only after sunset for 150 years, his face hidden behind a porcelain mask with a black and white hatched pattern that concealed everything except his eyes, and no citizen summoned to that throne room after dark ever knew whether they had been called to conduct business or to feed the thing behind the mask. The air in the chamber cold enough to see breath even in summer, the smell of something underneath the perfume that no one who returned was ever willing to describe. The merchants kept trading and the ships kept docking. The city functioned exactly as it had before. except the thing at the top of the chain no longer pretended to breathe, and the citizens who served beneath him learned quickly that the cost of stable governance under a vampire was a population that shrank slightly every year. The ones who vanished fed to a chalice called the Argral that Orlak had carved from the bones of the topaz dragon who had ruled the city before him, drinking from the skeleton of the last monster to sit on that throne while he sat on it himself. He created at least a dozen vampires in the catacombs beneath the palace, building an undead court below the living city that mirrored the government above it. When Orlak was eventually destroyed, the system he built did not collapse with him. A succession of vampire lords called the Night Kings inherited control of the city's criminal underworld through a guild called the Night Masks, and that guild maintained its grip on Westgate for over 1,000 years after the vampire who created it turned to dust. Orlak proved a vampire could rule a city in the open without pretending to be anything other than what it was. But the next ones did not need a throne at all. They just turned the people sent to stop them. Inside one of the most stable kingdoms on the continent, a region called Cormyr, where the law held and the crown kept order, and the purple dragons enforced peace along roads that merchants traveled without armed escorts. A hero was dispatched to deal with a vampire threat at a fortress called Skull Crag Keep in the mountains. He came back changed and turned on his own mother, the woman who had raised him killed by the son she had sent to protect the kingdom. And the kingdom that had sent him to solve the problem became the next thing the problem consumed. Two vampires called Khulzond and Mordroka had been operating inside the kingdom's borders for years, waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. A defender sent alone into their territory, who could be turned and sent home carrying the curse back into the family that had trusted him to end it. The fortress did not fall from siege or starvation. It fell because the system only needed one mistake, one person who walked into the wrong room without backup, to convert a kingdom's strength into its own weapon. Khulzond and Mordroka corrupted defenders inside a kingdom, but the next vampire did not need to corrupt anyone. It woke up inside a criminal empire that was already built. A stasis clone of the archmage Manshoon, one of dozens of magical copies created by a wizard so afraid of death that he duplicated himself across hidden vaults throughout Faerun, was found sleeping in a vault beneath Westgate by one of the Night Kings who still controlled the city's underworld. The Night King turned the sleeping clone into a vampire while it lay in stasis, and when it woke, it carried the full arcane power of Manshoon, fused with vampiric hunger, and the fracturing madness that came from knowing it was a copy of a man who might still be alive somewhere else. It hunted down the Night King who had made it, and killed the thing that had given it this curse, seized the Night Masks, and gruesomely eliminated every rival who challenged its claim, then purged every member it considered unnecessary or disloyal, draining them one by one over a period of months, until the guild had been reduced from over 2,000 operatives down to fewer than 900, the bodies of the ones it deemed unfit disposed of, through the same catacombs where Orlak had built his throne centuries before. The criminal network called the Jander was rebuilt from a fortress called Stormwatch Castle, and the thing that rebuilt it fought the legendary wizard Elminster, the most famous archmage on the continent, multiple times without dying. It called itself Orlak II, then Orbakh, and for decades it operated as one of the most dangerous things walking the realms. An insane archmage who was also a vampire, who was also a copy of a man who had been trying to cheat death since before most nations on the continent existed. The Jander under Orbakh spread agents through every major trade city on the Sword Coast, the same criminal network that still operated in Baldur's Gate centuries later when the hunger found new hosts in the old streets. Orbakh fused vampirism with arcane power and rebuilt a criminal empire that stretched across trade routes the Jander had been bleeding for decades. The next vampire did not conquer a kingdom. She built one that did not know it belonged to her. A kingdom called Elturel, tucked between mountains and farmland far from the great powers of the north, appeared from the outside to be a sleepy pastoral country where the villages ran on schedule and invading armies found nothing worth taking. By night, a bandit army poured out of caverns beneath a barony called Alakem and raided every neighboring country within riding distance, stripping caravans and border towns while the kingdom above slept peacefully in beds that had been made for them by hands they never questioned. The vampire who built this invisible second kingdom was called Saestra Karanok, daughter of the ruler of a city called Luthcheq in a region called Chesenta, where her own brother had locked her inside a crypt as a cruel joke and left her there for 9 days. She emerged changed. 2 minds lived inside the same body, one sweet and generous when she had fed, delivering food baskets and healing herbs to the people who trusted her, smiling at faces she would not remember an hour later. The other, a savage killer whose eyes flashed violet in the moment before she ended someone. The shift between the 2 personalities so complete that the people who loved the first version could not recognize the second even when they were staring at the same face. The anti-wizard persecutions her family ran became cover for feeding, accusing innocent people of practicing forbidden magic and draining them during private interrogations that no one survived. Her eyes flashing a brilliant violet in the moment before each kill. The same violet that flashed during the public executions she supervised in daylight when she was pretending to be the kind one. The people of Luthcheq calling the night killer the Lady of the Night, without knowing the woman delivering food baskets to their homes in the morning and the thing hunting them without mercy after dark were the same person, the bodies disposed of through channels her family had already built for executing accused sorcerers. When the city discovered what she was and drove her out, she fled to Elcazar, seduced its king, turned him, and built a country that was 2 countries at once, one that fed in daylight and one that hunted after dark. Saestra proved a vampire could own a kingdom without anyone knowing the crown had teeth, but the next vampire did not need a nation at all. He brought down a building that a god had built to protect knowledge from exactly this kind of corruption. A library dedicated to the god of knowledge, a place called the Edificant Library carved into the Snowflake Mountains where priests spent their lives copying texts by candlelight in halls designed to outlast the civilizations that had produced the knowledge stored inside them, became a vampire's nest in a matter of days. An exiled cleric named Kierkan Rufo, branded with a mark of shame by the order that had expelled him for betraying the brothers who had sheltered him, drank a magical elixir called the Chaos Curse that killed him where he stood. He rose 3 days later as a master vampire, the physical vessel of the curse itself, a horror called Twanta Quero Miankai, the most fatal horror. The priests who had served the library were turned into monsters that hunted the same corridors where they had once shelved manuscripts, creatures that still wore their holy vestments while feeding on the scholars who had not yet been caught. Rufo desecrated the halls they had sworn to protect, and when the survivors tried to destroy him, he denied his own god while burning alive, fighting through divine fire with a fury that should have been impossible for something that had once knelt at the same altars, screaming defiance at the deity whose symbol still hung on the walls around him. The library was permanently corrupted. Nothing could cleanse what had happened inside it. And they demolished the building, stone by stone, tearing apart centuries of preserved knowledge because the only way to kill what Rufo had created was to erase the place where it had been born. They destroyed the library to end it, but the next city that tried to destroy its vampire paid a price worse than anything the vampire had ever done. The holiest city on the western Sword Coast, a place called Elturel, where the legendary cavalry known as the Hell Riders rode out to protect the surrounding lands from threats that most cities would have sealed their gates against, discovered that its own ruler, a figure called the High Rider, who commanded those same Hell Riders, was a vampire who had been riding out at dawn to defend the city he was draining after dark, building a network of spawn and charmed servants and undead allies, so vast that when the Hell Riders turned on him, they won during the day and lost everything back at night. The city splitting into 2 wars fought across the same streets depending on whether the sun was up. Citizens barricading their doors at dusk and listening to the sounds of fighting in the streets they had walked that morning, waiting for dawn the way a drowning person waits for the surface. A priest named Thavius Krieg went to the archdevil Zariel, one of the 9 devil lords who each ruled a layer of the 9 hells, and made a deal. The price of salvation was a contract signed in secret, and what Zariel delivered in return was a second sun, a blazing sphere of divine light called the Companion, that appeared over the city and burned the vampire lord and every one of his spawn to ash in a single blast that turned night into noon across the entire valley. The city celebrated, and the High Rider's name was never recorded, erased from history by the people who wanted to forget what he had done to them. But the deal Thavius Krieg had signed carried a 50-year expiration, and when those 50 years ran out, the Companion reversed itself and dragged the entire city of Elturel down into Avernus, the first layer of the 9 hells, where the endless war between devils and demons had been grinding since before mortals had a word for eternity, and the city hung suspended over a battlefield of devils, while the citizens who had celebrated their salvation screamed for a rescue that almost did not come, and the city that destroyed its vampire paid with itself. Elturel burned itself to kill one vampire, and the largest city on the Sword Coast looked at that and chose the opposite. Waterdeep had seen vampires before, centuries earlier, when Jander fed on asylum patients in the same districts where merchants now walked without looking twice at the buildings around them. But this time, the arrangement beneath the streets was different. A vampire called Artor Morlin made a deal with Ogairon, the legendary archmage who had founded the city's magical protections, a deal that gave Artor territorial rights to hunt inside the city walls in exchange for a single promise that he would keep every other vampire out. He honored the arrangement for 4 centuries, driving out or killing every rival who encroached on his territory, operating from chambers deep beneath the city called the Dungeon of the Crypt, where the walls had not seen sunlight since before the deal was signed. And the method he used to destroy his competition was the most perverse instrument any vampire on the continent had ever devised. Because Artor Morlin dominated servants inside the Church of Lathander, the god of the morning sun, the deity whose entire doctrine was built on destroying undead, and those dominated servants fed the church information about every rival vampire operating in Waterdeep, so the church's own hunters would track down and destroy Artor's competition for him, the god of sunlight weaponized into a pest control service for the thing living beneath the streets. Every 5 years, Artor dragged whichever servant had been feeding the church down into the Dungeon of the Crypt and drained the life out of someone who had spent half a decade believing they were serving a holy cause, then created a new one from whatever body was closest, sending each replacement to the surface to test whether anyone remembered his lair, cycling through lives the way a merchant cycles through inventory. He bought a Medusa from the slave market in Skullport when it was still a young creature barely old enough to understand what it was, raised it from infancy in the darkness of his crypt as the only parent it ever knew, trained it to kill without hesitation or emotion. And when it reached adulthood, he turned it into a vampire whose serpent hair each carried the curse in their bite, a creature that hated him with everything it had and could not disobey a single command he gave, bound to guard the passages to the surface in the Dungeon of the Crypt, for a master it despised and could never escape. The people of Waterdeep lived above a predator who had been given permission to feed on them by the same archmage whose protective wards they thanked every time they walked safely through the city gates, and for 400 years, the arrangement held, a city feeding its own citizens to a thing beneath the streets in exchange for protection from something worse. Waterdeep negotiated coexistence, but the next vampire did not negotiate. She went to war against the criminal guild that ran half the Sword Coast. In the merchant capital of a nation called Amn, a city called Athkatla, where the Shadow Thieves, the most entrenched criminal guild on the western coast, controlled the docks and the trade routes and the flow of stolen goods across borders that legitimate merchants could not cross without paying tribute, a vampire faction launched an open assault on the guild's territory, direct conflict between vampiric power and mortal criminal empire, and within weeks the streets had become so dangerous after dark that the city imposed a general curfew. The entire population of one of the wealthiest cities on the continent locked indoors at sunset, while vampires and thieves killed each other in the alleyways outside their windows. The vampire who started the war was an elf called Bodhi, sister of a mage named Irenicus. And even Irenicus himself noted that Bodhi was killing far more people than she needed to. The shadow thieves she captured alive, sent not to her lair, but to her brother's laboratory, where Irenicus conducted experiments that stripped divine souls from living bodies. And when Irenicus finished stealing a victim's soul and handed the empty husk to Bodhi, she did not kill them. She locked them in a labyrinth beneath the asylum and hunted them through the corridors for sport, stalking soulless prisoners through tunnels designed to test whether inmates were sane, playing with her prey before finishing them because the killing was less interesting to her than the chase. She kidnapped the people her victims loved most, turning lovers and companions into vampires to hurt the ones who had tried to stop her. The guild that had controlled crime across the entire Sword Coast for generations, learning what it felt like to be harvested by something that did not negotiate terms. The aftermath of this war left blood fountains still running in Bodhi's lair beneath Athkatla, the curfew still holding across the merchant quarter, the shadow thieves still counting the members they had lost to a conflict that proved vampires had reached the point where hiding and pretending to be part of the mortal world was no longer necessary. Bodhi proved vampires could wage war on mortal institutions without bothering to disguise it, but even she left the city standing when she was done with it, and the next vampire did not. A vampire lord who called himself the Pale Knight and claimed to be the first vampire king in all of Toril built his fortress at the edge of the Battle of Bones, a cursed killing field east of the Sword Coast where an army of undead had been slaughtered centuries earlier and the bones had never stopped moving. From the keep of Pale Knight, he commanded an army of vampires, nightwalkers and nightshades, creatures born from the plane of shadow itself. And when he was ready, he transported a weapon called the Onyx Tower directly into the heart of Baldur's Gate. In a single night, the vampire called Mordoc used the Onyx Heart to transform the entire population of the city into zombies under his control. Every merchant, every dock worker, every fisherman on the harbour, every guard on every wall, turned into shambling dead things that obeyed the creature who had killed them, and his vampires moved through the streets, turning whoever was left into more of their kind. He renamed the city Mordoc's Gate and opened a passage for his allies from Mulhorand to enter the tower, and the soldiers camped outside the walls launched a desperate attack against a city that was now defended by the corpses of the people they had been sent to protect. It took a month of siege and 8 adventurers storming the tower to destroy the Onyx Heart and undo what Mordoc had done, restoring the city to the living. But the knowledge that Baldur's Gate had been taken and turned in a single night never left the memory of anyone who survived it. Centuries later, a stone bust sat displayed in a vampire lord's mansion in the upper city of Baldur's Gate, a pale face carved from marble sitting on a shelf as if it belonged there, and the name carved beneath it was Mordoc Celenmere, kept as a trophy by the vampire who came next. The worst vampire on the continent was not waging war at all. He was doing something no vampire had ever attempted, turning his own kind into raw material. Beneath a palace in Baldur's Gate, in chambers carved so far below the streets that the sound of the city above had been swallowed by stone centuries ago, hundreds of vampire spawn hung in chains bolted to walls that had never been cleaned, their bodies preserved in a state between death and something worse than death, conscious and starving and unable to move or scream, unable to do anything except wait in the dark. For the moment their master decided they were ready to be consumed. They were not servants or soldiers or tools for feeding or infiltration or any of the purposes that every other vampire on this continent had used spawn for since the curse first arrived in the realms. They were components, raw material for a ritual called the Rite of Profane Ascension, a ceremony that required the sacrifice of thousands of spawn to transform one vampire into something that had never existed before, something beyond vampirism and beyond undeath and beyond anything the gods of Faerun had designed the curse to produce. The vampire who built this operation was called Cazador Szarr, and his palace sat in the middle of a city that had no idea what was happening beneath its foundations. He had made a pact with Mephistopheles, the archdevil who ruled Cania, the 8th layer of the 9 hells, a frozen wasteland where even devils avoided the cold, and the pact gave him access to knowledge that no mortal necromancer could have assembled alone, the precise architecture of a ritual that would consume every spawn he had ever created in a single act of transformation, so complete that the thing on the other side of it would not remember what it had been. Cazador had been made by a vampire called Velioth, known as the Martinet, who had tortured him for years before turning him, and the methods Velioth used became the template Cazador applied to his own spawn, each generation of the curse inheriting the cruelty of the one that made it, the abuse flowing downward through the bond like water finding the lowest ground. He carved 7 of his spawn with ritual scars. He kept the rest hanging in lightless chambers beneath the city, feeding them just enough to keep them conscious, starving them just enough to keep them desperate, preserving hundreds of lives in a state of sustained agony for the sole purpose of burning them all at once when the ritual was ready. Every vampire on this continent had used the master spawn bond as a leash, but Cazador was the first to realize it could be a fuel line. Among the hundreds of spawn hanging in chains beneath Baldur's Gate, one had been a magistrate of the city before Cazador found him, a man who had spent his mortal life enforcing the laws of a city that could not enforce anything in the chambers below its own streets. Cazador controlled him for 200 years, sending him into the city at night to lure victims back to the palace. A magistrate who had once protected the people of Baldur's Gate, now delivering them to the thing that fed on them. He could not refuse because the bond did not allow refusal, and he walked the streets he had once patrolled in service of the city and used the trust his old position still carried to bring people to their deaths. Every night, for 2 centuries. A mind flayer ship crashed near Baldur's Gate, and the creatures aboard it fed on brains and controlled minds through parasites implanted directly in the skull. And among their specimens was the magistrate who had served Cazador for 200 years. The parasite the mind flayers forced into his brain did something none of them intended. It interfered with the vampiric bond that connected him to Cazador, the signal that had controlled every movement and every decision for 2 centuries, suddenly scrambled by a second presence in his skull that did not care about vampires or masters or the architecture of obedience that had kept him chained since before most of the city above had been born. For the first time in 200 years, the compulsions went quiet. The voice that had told him where to walk, who to bring back, when to feed, falling silent until he could think, until he could choose. His name was Astarion, and he chose to walk away. The streets of Baldur's Gate stretched ahead of him in morning light that should have killed him, the parasite in his brain shielding him from the sun the way it shielded him from the bond, and the city moved around him the way it always had. Merchants setting up stalls along the docks, fishermen hauling catches from boats that had left before dawn, guards walking routes they had walked every morning since before he was turned, none of them aware that the man passing through the market had spent 2 centuries delivering their neighbors to a palace they had never thought to investigate. The harbour fog rolled across the lower city where the old gates still stood, the same gates that had been standing when Cazador first arrived, the same stone that had watched 1,000 years of vampires move through the Sword Coast without anyone building a system capable of stopping them for good. Baldur's Gate continued, the fishing boats rocking in the harbour while the morning vendors called prices to no one in particular. And somewhere beneath the streets, the chains still hung from the walls in chambers that had not yet been found, and the city above them went on doing what cities do, which is survive the things living underneath them by choosing, every single day, not to look down.